To be successful at the Security Plus exam, you're going to need to know a little bit about biometrics as an authentication method. Well, we're going to talk about that coming up right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus. And in today's episode, we are talking all about biometrics. This is where we use our own physical attributes to kind of prove we are who we say we are. Am I correct about this, Mr. West?
You have got it right. That's right. And we have kind of talked a little bit about biometrics when we talked about authentication factors. So as a kind of a recap here, let's talk a little bit about biometrics, and what we're really going to be spending time on is a little bit more on the biometrics themselves and how we can judge accuracy. All right, and that's important here because you've seen this before, right? Biometrics, when we talk about authentication factors, something you know, password, something you have is a smart card, biometrics, right? Examples of that, some physical characteristic of yourself, right? And that is really what biometrics boils down to, right? Some kind of physical characteristic of yourself. And it's commonly added to multi-factor authentication, or even two-factor, if you will. Just remember that multi-factor authentication is just more than one of those authentication factors. If you have two of those, well, it's two-factor. You have three-factor. In some cases, you might see systems that require you to have a password, have a smart card, and maybe even some kind of biometrics authentication. That would be a three-factor authentication. So these are kind of some of the things that we've really already established, but definitely know it. And since it's biometrics episode in general, we kind of recap it.
And Wes, there's a bit of a laundry list of different attributes that you can use toward this end. Is that correct?
That's right. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those methods that we have, or the attributes like you're talking about, because that's essentially what it does. What attribute of the human, I guess,
person,
physiology that you would use, right? So we can use things like fingerprints, probably one of the most common and most widely adopted biometrics today.
I take mine everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I do too. My laptop, my phone. You've probably seen these before. I remember there was a day, Dan, and God, we've been doing this long enough now that we used to say in the earlier days of IT Pro TV, man, biometric systems, they are just so expensive to implement.
Sure.
Except today, where they're on every single smartphone just about that you have out there on the market. I've got one on my laptop. Dan's got one on his laptop.
Got one on my phone.
Yeah, so they're very, very common today. So that is one common biometrics type of implementation. Now, the other things that we have too, you've probably seen before. Not only are we using things like fingerprint, but we can also use voice recognition systems. Now, voice recognition systems can be some that can be tricky to handle things like accuracy. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about accuracy. It's probably one of the easier ones, if I would say, out of all of them, maybe to spoof, if you will, because if you think about it, if I record a voice, it's just a bunch of frequencies, and if I can mimic that and copy that, I could probably maybe falsify that.
Let's test it. Alexa, buy 600 bottles of Tide.
All right, very good. Now, thank goodness I don't use Alexa, so I'm okay. That's right. Now, I will say, if I find a whole 600 bottles of Tide,
in trouble.
Man, I'm going to be doing a lot of laundry.
Someone's yelling, cancel, cancel.
That's right. So voice is an example of biometrics method that we have, but we also have more sophisticated types. These are probably some that you've seen in maybe some of the action flicks out there, when you're getting into things like top secret facilities and stuff. Hand geometry scanner, just highly secure environments. And these are some of the ones that we'll mention coming up are the more expensive ones that we still say today that if you're going to implement something like this, you're going to have some pretty sophisticated and expensive technology. A hand geometry scanner would be one.
It's funny, my uncle actually owns a company that builds biometrics hand scanners for the government.
Very good.
He can't talk about it too much, though.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Not if you want to keep breathing oxygen. Yeah. That's right. So hand geometry scanner. Now, I went ahead and I combined a couple of these here because it's really all based around your eye, right? A retina scanner versus an iris scanner. That's something that's specific and unique to you and only you. So it is a way that you can perform biometrics authentication. Now, there are some other ones that are out there too. Facial recognition systems. If you've ever sat down in front of a webcam, maybe built into a laptop, you've probably seen that before. I know it's in things like the iPhones today, as well as a lot of the Android devices where you can basically authenticate via your facial recognition. I think Windows Hello allows you to do this as well. And Honestly, sometimes that one's kind of annoying.
I've seen Don like cover his camera so that it doesn't try to log him in so he can do something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Hey, because that's one that the moment the camera sees you, it says, "Oh, you definitely want to log in." So
I
facial,
know that guy.
that's right. He looks a lot like Don. So facial recognition systems, they're an example of a biometrics authentication. Now, this one's a more complicated one, and this is one that's got a little bit of controversy behind it, and that's veins, if you will, too. Think of things like cardiovascular or vascular signature recognition, right? And that's because it's really, your veins, they're unique to you. Your circulatory system is unique to you. And I remember one of the first times I heard this populating. This was about being able to recognize in an instance where maybe somebody is like robbing a bank, and I hate to say it, but they've got the gun out there and they've got systems that can flash the arm, basically recognizing the veins in the system here to try to authenticate them. However, again, with things like PII and HIPAA compliance, this is still one of those ones that I'm not saying Big Brother. I'm just saying Big Brother.
It's in that gray area.
It really is.
Of taking, it's basically like a fingerprint of your body's circulatory system, right?
That's exactly it. I like the way you put that. It's like a fingerprint for your veins, if you will. And and it is specific to you. Now, there are other things too, like how do you walk? This could be something you do as well. So this kind of blurs the line between something you are and something you do, if you will. And what I mean by that is what's known as gait analysis is another type of authentication mechanism. It's one of the newer ones that we actually have to be aware of on the exam. With the fact that they have a lot of the health monitors out there, Fitbits and stuff like that, they can actually build in some kind of authentication based on, for instance, if you're a runner, how's your stride, how many steps do you take in a normal pattern, if you will. So again, gait analysis is another.
I think it's important for our audio-only listeners to understand it's GAIT gait, not GATE.
That's right. That's right.
The distance that your feet are apart when you walk or run.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not talking about Watergate, right?
It's funny. I remember this being used to identify whether or not they actually had the correct Saddam Hussein.
Interesting.
Like whether or not, or it was something to that effect. It was some famous person that was either, they said, had been replaced by a double or something to that effect. So I've heard about this one for a long time, but it's interesting now that it's coming up as a biometric for maybe authentication.
Well, if you think about it, Dan, one of the gait analysis, and not in an authentication mechanism, but I know, I haven't done it recently, but I'm a runner, and I know my wife is a runner too. And one of the things that, like when we wanted to go in and get new shoes, right, they had these systems that would tell you exactly where the impact, how you impacted, how far your distance was. Are you a heel striker, toe striker, if you will, toe down first, heel down first? And then what they would do is they would look at the gait that you were using, and then they would tailor what shoe you were going to get based on how you walked. I don't know if somebody got the clever idea that said, well, hey, if we can do that to identify the shoe you need, maybe we can use that same information to identify you, right? So again, gait analysis, thank you too for the spelling there. That is how you walk, not the gates, that are in a gated community, if you will.
Now, Wes, it would seem that any of these mechanisms would be foolproof, right? Your eye is your eye. Your fingerprint is your fingerprint, and therefore we would be able to use them with a very high rate of accuracy to say, oh, this proves you are who you say you are. But not all these systems work as well as we would hope that they would, right?
Most definitely. In fact, let's take that first example that Dan makes, or statement that Dan makes. That's what we want, right? We want it to have that high rate of accuracy that says when Dan puts his finger on the thumbprint scanner, it recognizes Dan. If he puts his hand on the hand geometry scanner, it recognizes Dan. That's the goal. But in reality, these systems have to be fine-tuned. There's a little bit of a learning process that they go through, and it is an adjustment that happens that has to be made. Let's talk about something known as efficacy rates. In fact, we've got a couple of different, three that I can think of. We have what's known as the false rejection rate, FRR. We have what's known as the false acceptance rate, and we also have something known as the crossover error rate. Now, I'm going to go ahead and mention that this is also called another one that you'll see, equal error rate, and you'll see why it's also called that, but more commonly standardized, it's called the crossover error rate. Let's see what we're talking about when we talk about a bunch of acronyms, because you already have plenty of them. So let's talk about the false rejection rate, all right? This is one that's also called a type 1 error. We'll talk about the type 2 coming up now, that's far, all right? This is where an authorized user is rejected. All right, now, Why would that be bad? All right. Well, I want you to remember we've talked about the principles or the goals, the pillars of security, the iron triangle, as you might, the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. All right. Even though an authorized user was, I mean, kind of like it did its job, but it didn't allow the authorized user into the system, that's going to affect availability, right? It's going to there's going to be a reduction, if you will, in productivity. There's going to be a certain level of cost to do a re-authentication, if you will, and it's very frustrating. It's a very frustrating error for authorized users. However, this is better than the next one that we're going to talk about. All right, when authorized users don't gain access, it gets a little irritating. I know I'm supposed to be here. I work for IT Pro TV. I'm trying to authenticate against this door and it's not letting me in. All right, yeah, it's frustrating. However, when the next one here, and I've already kind of mentioned this, availability is lost. The next one here is false acceptance rate. False acceptance rate is known as a type 2 error. All right, and this is where an unauthorized user is granted access. All right, now, this is the worst of the two. All right, so let's think about this. I'm an authorized user, all right? I go to authenticate with biometrics to some kind of security door, all right? Maybe I'm in a man trap between a public access area and a secure area, and I go to authenticate. I'm stuck in the man trap. I can't get in. Yes, it's frustrating. That's right. But the system did its job. Didn't accurately do its job, but it did keep it kept people out. However, this error is when, let's say Dan, I'm going to pick on Dan here. Let's say that neatly groomed and sunglassed hoodie wearing person is Dan. All right, he's the hacker. I don't see the resemblance. You don't see the resemblance? Okay, we'll have to work on that one. So let's say that's an unauthorized user. That's a hacker. They do the same thing. They go up and they authenticate, and it says, access granted. Well, think about the two errors. If you grant access to an unauthorized user, confidentiality and integrity can no longer be guaranteed. All right. So this is one of those ones that is the worst out of the two, the type 1 and the type 2. So definitely know the difference between an FRR, right, the false rejection rate, and the false acceptance rate. It means false is we incorrectly, here's another way you could think of it, false, incorrectly. Rejection, we incorrectly rejected a user. False acceptance, because sometimes you get in this, you get into that exam, and you're like, oh man, what's an easy way? False is incorrect. Acceptance, you're allowed. We incorrectly allowed somebody to come in that shouldn't have access. False rejection, we incorrectly rejected somebody. That's an authorized user. So those might be a couple that you think ways to think of it on the exam, especially when you get in that time crunch and you're kind of sweating on the answers there. Hopefully that'll help you out a little.
That is super helpful because when you use terminology such as that, they didn't ask us, right? Or we would have named it incorrectly because that's an easier way to say that. At least in my estimation, I think Wes would agree with me on that. It can get you all kind of twisted up. So great job, I think, Wes, that you've done with showing us how we need to think about that so we don't get jumbled up when it comes to the exam. Now, we've gone over the first two errors. Let's go back to that CER, that crossover error rate. Tell us a little more about this and how we need to understand it so we can be successful in that exam booth.
Yeah, Dan. So when we talk about the crossover error rate, I also mentioned another term too, and the term is what's known as the equal error rate. You'll see why we say equal error here. So if we have this graph here, errors versus the increase of how many errors versus how sensitive, you'll notice that you have a certain amount in your graph for the false rejection rate. You also have a certain level in the graph of the false acceptance rate. Now notice where these 2 points are equal, right? That's why they call it the equal error rate. That point right there is what's known as the crossover. Where the 2 points cross there or are equal, hence the two terms, right? And that point within your biometric system defines how accurate the system is, right? If this crossover error rate is higher, that means less accuracy. So what you want is a lower crossover error rate. And the lower the crossover or equal error rate is, the more accurate a system is. Let me go a little bit farther here, right? Not only describing the overall accuracy, let's look at two systems, right? We have system 1 and system 2. All right, same graphs that we had before. Notice where system 1, its false acceptance rate and its false rejection rate, where they cross. notice where the crossover error rate is. All right, look at system 2. System 2, we also have the false acceptance rate, and we have the false rejection rate, and we have the crossover error rate. Do you see how one's lower than the other? In this case, what we would say is that system 2 is more accurate than system 1. All right, and that's where going back to Dan's initial statement, right? We want it to be as accurate as possible, right? But it doesn't happen all the time. Even though that's the goal, sometimes we have to go back and we have to figure out, where do we adjust the sensitivity so it's not so sensitive that we get false rejection rates, but not so insensitive, I guess. You know, maybe we're gonna, maybe it needs a psychiatrist, that we are allowing unauthorized users, right? So we want that crossover error rate to be lower, which means that the overall biometric system that we're implementing has a more accurate count of what's going on.
And the great thing about it is, if you really break it down, you see the graphs that you have in front of us, either or both of those FAR or FRR errors, as long as they go down,
that's right,
the more accuracy, obviously, inherently, the system is going to be, and therefore your CER is going to be much lower, which is what we want, and that's a really good thing. So if you can adjust for either of those things, or both, which is the best idea,
yeah, that's right,
you're going to get a super low CER, and you're going to have a happy system and happy users getting authenticated using their biometrics. Very cool stuff. Anything else that we need to go over when it comes to biometrics, Wes?
No, Dan, I think that's it. Just basic terminology here, and kind of understand that if you've given like some kind of metric like that, that the lower that crossover or equal error rate, the more accurate your biometric system is.
All right. Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, biometrics is as simple as, it's just physical attributes about people to help authenticate them, but it has a lot more minutia and depth to it than on first glance. So definitely go over these concepts, make sure you understand them, because we want you to be successful when you sit the exam. That being said, we have more to come in the Security Plus exam, and you'll have to see us then. We will see you then, hopefully. Then, until then, have a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.